David Carter. For 17 years, his name sat quietly on a missing persons list. No headlines, no dramatic theories, just a man who left one day and never came back. He vanished after what was supposed to be a normal drive. No goodbye that raised alarms, no signs of distress. His phone went silent, his vehicle disappeared, and the trail ended abruptly, as if he had simply faded out of existence. At first, investigators treated it as a routine disappearance. Friends said David knew the area well. Family insisted he had no reason to run. There were no financial red flags, no heated arguments, no history that suggested he would abandon his life. Searches were conducted along roads, nearby properties, wooded areas. Flyers went up. Tips came in, all vague, all leading nowhere. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. And slowly, the case went cold. What no one realized was that the answer had been there from the very beginning, hidden beneath dark, still water that swallowed both evidence and sound. The reservoir near David's last known route was searched only briefly. Visibility was poor. The water was deep, filled with silt, debris, and decades of sediment. At the time, there was no clear reason to believe his car was there. No tire marks, no broken guardrails, no witnesses who saw anything go wrong. So the reservoir was ruled out. Life moved on for everyone except David's family. For 17 years, they lived in uncertainty, not knowing whether to grieve or hope. Every ring of the phone brought the same question. Is this finally the call? It would take new technology, fresh eyes, and a decision to search where people had stopped looking for the truth to finally surface. And when it did, it would change everything. The breakthrough didn't come from a confession, a tip, or a sudden memory resurfacing. It came from the water. Years after David Carter disappeared, advances in sonar technology and a renewed push to re-examine cold cases led investigators back to the reservoir near his last known route. This time, the approach was different. Instead of relying on divers alone, search teams used high-resolution side-scan sonar capable of detecting shapes buried beneath layers of silt and vegetation. Almost immediately, something appeared on the screen. A long, rectangular outline resting on the reservoir floor. It didn't look like a rock. It didn't match natural formations. The shape was too clean, too deliberate. And it was positioned at a depth and angle that made one thing painfully clear. If a vehicle had entered the water here, it would have vanished without a trace. Divers were sent down. Visibility was nearly zero. The water was thick, dark, and cold. The bottom of the reservoir was layered with years of sediment, branches, and debris carried in by storms and runoff. As the divers followed the sonar coordinates, their lights finally cut across metal. A vehicle. It was upright, mostly intact, and covered so heavily in algae and silt that it looked like it had grown out of the reservoir itself. The moment they brushed away enough debris to reveal part of the frame, the truth began to surface. The car matched the make and model of David Carter's missing vehicle. There was no catastrophic damage, no evidence of a violent collision. Just a car that had left the road, slid into the water, and settled silently at the bottom. Inside, the discovery became even more sobering. Human remains were present. David hadn't disappeared into thin air. He hadn't started a new life. He hadn't been taken. He had been there the entire time. Investigators now understood why the case had stalled for so long. There were no witnesses because the crash made no sound loud enough to carry. No debris because the car didn't break apart. No tire marks because the shoreline had changed over time. reshaped by erosion and growth. The reservoir had done what water does best: hide everything. As recovery crews carefully raised the vehicle, decades of silence came with it. Mud poured from the doors, algae peeled away from the body, and with every inch it rose, a 17-year mystery moved closer to its end. With the vehicle now out of the reservoir, investigators began the slow and methodical process of reconstruction. Every detail was examined, not just to confirm identity, but to understand how a man could disappear for 17 years without anyone knowing where he went. The car showed signs of long-term submersion, but little evidence of impact. The front end wasn't crushed. The windshield wasn't shattered. This told investigators that David hadn't been speeding or fleeing. Instead, it suggested a gradual drift off the roadway, a moment of inattention, fatigue, or confusion that turned deadly in seconds. The road above the reservoir was re-examined. What they found was unsettling in its simplicity. A slight curve. No guardrail at the time David disappeared. Poor lighting. And a steep embankment that dropped directly into deep water. In dry conditions, the road seemed harmless, but at night or during rain, the edge would have been nearly invisible. Investigators believe David's tires left the pavement quietly. No screeching, no sudden braking. The car rolled forward, slid down the slope, and entered the water nose first. Once submerged, escape would have been extremely difficult. The doors would have been locked by pressure. Cold water would have rushed in. Panic would have set in almost instantly. The position of the remains suggested David was still in the driver's seat. He never made it out. Personal items recovered from inside the vehicle confirmed his identity beyond doubt. His disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy that had unfolded unseen. For David's family, the news brought a wave of conflicting emotions. There was heartbreak in knowing how long he had been gone. But there was also relief. Relief that he wasn't suffering somewhere unknown. Relief that the waiting, the not knowing, was finally over. The case was officially reclassified. David Carter was no longer missing. But one question lingered. How many other cases like this were still out there? David Carter's discovery didn't just close a case, it forced a reckoning. Investigators began reviewing other unresolved disappearances in the region, especially those involving people last seen driving alone. Cases that had once been dismissed as voluntary disappearances or unexplained vanishings were suddenly viewed through a different lens. If David's car could remain hidden for 17 years in a reservoir so close to a traveled road, how many others might still be waiting underwater? The answer was uncomfortable. Authorities compared old missing person files with maps of nearby bodies of water. Rivers, ponds, reservoirs, retention basins, places that had either been searched briefly or not at all. In many cases, the original searches had been limited by technology. Visibility was poor. Sonar was outdated. Divers were restricted by safety concerns. David's case proved that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. For his family, the days following the recovery were filled with quiet moments rather than public statements. They chose privacy, focusing on finally laying David to rest. For 17 years, they had lived suspended between hope and grief. Now, they could grieve fully. Painful, but necessary. Investigators also re-examined the original assumptions made in the early days of the case. At the time, there had been subtle pressure to believe David had left voluntarily. No forced entry, no threats, no immediate signs of danger. But the reservoir had told a different story. It showed how easily a life could disappear without criminal intent. how a familiar road could become fatal in seconds, and how water doesn't just hide objects, it erases moments. David Carter hadn't been a cold case because it was unsolvable. It had been cold because the truth was submerged. The final conclusion came not with shock, but with clarity. After 17 years of unanswered questions, investigators determined that David Carter's death was a tragic accident, one that unfolded silently and left no witnesses behind. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of another person involved, just a single moment where a familiar drive turned fatal. The reservoir had concealed everything. David's case now stands as a reminder of how deceptive disappearances can be. When a vehicle enters deep water without visible damage or noise, the scene above can remain untouched. No debris, no skid marks, no indication that anything ever went wrong. Time, weather, and water do the rest. They erase the story. For David's family, closure didn't mean relief from pain. It meant an end to waiting, an end to wondering if he was out there somewhere, lost or suffering. They finally had answers. They finally had a place to mourn. And for investigators, this case reshaped how missing person files are approached. Bodies of water once overlooked are now seen as critical locations. Advances in sonar and renewed attention have already led to other discoveries, other families finally getting the truth. David Carter's story is not unique, but it is important because it proves that some mysteries are not crimes, not conspiracies, not disappearances by choice. They are accidents hidden by nature, waiting patiently to be found. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe every missing person deserves answers, support this work. Like this video so these stories reach more people. Subscribe so no case is ever forgotten. And share this story because the next answer may still be waiting beneath the surface. Thank you for watching.